From my study, about 25 years of the fossil record, clearly it supports creation and not evolution.
This is Voice of Reason, with another episode of Debunking Creationists. Today we have yet another doctor, Dr. Jerry Bergman, who's going to tell us about his hobby of cherry-picking, collecting fossils.
And we are honored today to have with us Dr. Jerry Bergman. Dr. Bergman, how good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Bergman is one of the most credentialed guests that we have on Origins. He has 2 PhDs and literally a half a dozen master's degrees in various areas of science. But one of your passions is fossils, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I've always loved collecting fossils.
I collect spores, molds, and fungus.
Fossils are very important because Darwin based a lot of his theory on what he thought would be found, not that he saw, but that he thought would be found in the future in fossils.
Right, he thought the fossil record would either support or refute his idea of evolution.
And so we're here to sort of bring that into account and say, what has the fossil record shown us?
The earliest known fern, for example. Now, most of these pictures I'll show you are the earliest examples we have of the various examples of life that we've collected in fossils. And the earliest known ferns have remained the same, we know, for approximately 300 million years. And if you compare a modern fern with a fossil fern, you can see they are identical.
Now, I just have to ask you, do you believe that fossil's 300 million years old?
Well, I'm not going to, the dates I didn't date them, so I don't know. But it's interesting, if you look at the dates, it looks like, assuming they are correct, it looks like a lot of life, most life, has not changed at all in hundreds of millions of years.
So you're going with the dates of the people who have recorded them?
Right. These dates are all of the authorities who have dated them. And I don't want to go into various techniques of dating, but nonetheless, we'll just assume these are correct.
We'll just go with our dates for this show. Thank you.
Yeah, just assume they're correct and go forward.
If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say.
Okay, allow me to clarify that Dr. Bergman does not accept the dating of these fossils. He makes it clear in other writings and presentations that he is a young Earth creationist, or as he puts it, a 6-day creationist. Here, he is accepting the fossil ages for the sake of his argument, and in effect, claiming that even if they were that old, that fossils show no evolutionary change.
Sumac leaf, good example, and of course you can see the details here very clearly, and you can see the same details in the fossil example. Sycamore leaf, very distinct leaf, as you can see here from the fossil record, and you can see by looking at a modern example, very distinct, and again the vein structure is shown very clearly.
I'm not seeing much difference between the fossil and the living leaf there.
No, I can show these to my grandchild and say, okay, what kind of fossil is that? Where is that from? And they can look at it and say, well, that's a ginkgo leaf. So there's obviously so similar. This is a modern day example, and this is a fossil example, and you can see again, they are, as far as we can tell from the fossils, identical. Grape leaf, very clearly. Spruce seed, we see these every summer, every spring, and again you can see nice and clear. Pine leaf, very distinct, and you can see the pine leaf right here, very distinct in the fossil evaluation.
So far, Bergman has listed a few plant species that have not changed in millions of years. This is no surprise. Evolution is a phenomenon, not a law. There is no reason that all plants and animals must change, and there are multiple reasons why very long periods of evolutionary stasis can occur. Organisms generally change to adapt to changes in the physical environment, and also due to the introduction of new competition, predators, or parasites, and other factors. When these elements of the environment are relatively stable, and species are well adapted to it, there is no reason for them to undergo change. In fact, in those cases, natural selection can act to keep the animals largely the same, despite inevitable mutations and genetic drift. Also, without genetic isolation, speciation is unlikely to occur. But notice the huge differences of the dates of appearances of these species, ranging from 300 million years ago for the fern to just 15 for the spruce and pine. One might ask where all the spruce and pine trees were for the 285 million years in between. Bergman offers no explanation. Of course, he doesn't actually accept that much time has passed, but he has failed to provide an explanation for the undeniable progression of new fossil species in the record. It is also interesting to note that the earliest fern species do appear over 360 million years ago, actually, but ferns are not a single species, but rather a group of about 12,000 species today, and many of those did not appear until roughly 145 million years ago, so he has hardly shown that there is no change.
And crinoids, they're invertebrates, they live in shallow water, and their detail you can see, modern crinoids right here, and you can see in the fossil record, when you examine this under a microscope very carefully, you can see the enormous similarity, at least the external morphology is very, very similar to modern day examples. Starfish, this is dated at 490 million years old.
Crinoids and starfish are both echinoderms, a phylum of marine animals which first arose in the Cambrian, about 540 million years ago, and are distinguished by their 5-point radial symmetry, their nerve net nervous system with no central brain, and other anatomical features. Bergman wants us to believe that crinoids and starfish just appear with no possible ancestors, but this is not the case. Also, like the ferns, the echinoderms have radiated from a few ancestral species into many new species as time went on, today numbering about 7,000, and many more that went extinct. That's a lot of evolution. The fact that some of the earliest forms still exist is not an argument against the evolution that we do see in the record. Evolution usually does not occur in lines, but in a branching bush-like pattern, with ancestral species radiating out into many new species and families. Some of the branches of the bush can survive and remain largely unchanged, while others change dramatically.
Herring, there's a lot of examples of fish. Probably 80% of all fossils are of marine creatures. And a garfish, very distinct fish. You can tell that pretty quickly from many other kinds of fish by the snout area here. And again, you can see the same thing in the fossil record. Spider, it's not just plants, but also, in this case, a spider. A dragonfly, very distinct. In fact, there's a lot of dragonflies in the fossil record. Ants, wasps, and so on, preserved in amber. Amber is tree sap. A lot of insects have ended up in amber, and therefore we can compare, especially external morphology, with modern-day ants, and we can see, in this case, a winged ant is identical. And a grasshopper, and of course you look at that, you can see, well, that's a grasshopper.
Now, there's a point that you're making with all of this, isn't there, sir?
Yeah, the point is very clear, and that is, when we look at these fossils and compare it with modern-day examples, we see virtually no change whatsoever. Now, in some cases, I'll show later, there is change, but the change is very minimal. And these are the earliest fossils that I've been able to find in the fossil record, in this case, for example, of a bee. And again, that's identical, as far as we can tell, to modern-day bees.
So Bergman continues to pick out a few species out of the over 8 million that exist today.
I don't like this.
You only have 75 more to go, okay?
And pretends that they show a pattern that accurately represents the whole fossil record. Really? That's ridiculously dishonest. Of course, there are many lineages of fossil species that do show tremendous change. If you were from outer space and had never seen a cat, I could show you 5,000 black cats, and only black cats, and you would logically assume all cats are black. And you would be completely wrong. That's the level of cherry picking Bergman is trying to get away with here. Also, notice how there is a pattern here that Bergman is completely ignoring. Herring and garfish are fish. Dragonflies, wasps, ants, grasshoppers, and bees are all insects. These groups share traits that unmistakably link them together. All insects have 6 legs, a 3-part body, an exoskeleton, compound eyes, and a pair of antennae. Evolution from a common ancestor perfectly explains this pattern of shared traits unique to a group of animals. And indeed, we have primitive insect fossils with some or all of these features that predate all of Bergman's insect examples. Creationism provides no explanation for this pattern. The common designer plea that creationists often make doesn't explain the overall pattern of nested hierarchies. All plants and animals share unique traits with other members of a group of related species, but many of these traits are not found at all in other groups. For example, spiders are not insects, even though they are often mistaken to be insects because of their superficial similarity. They are arachnids, a class that also includes scorpions, mites, and ticks. But arachnids are designed differently from insects, with 8 legs instead of 6, just 2 body segments, simple eyes rather than compound eyes, and no antennae. Did spiders have a different designer than the insects? And these differences are not due to a functional necessity, as one might expect if they were intelligently designed, as both insects and arachnids can thrive in the same environments. And DNA evidence also shows the exact same pattern of specific commonalities among related species that are not shared outside the group, again showing common inheritance. Unlike Bergman's supposed pattern, the nested hierarchy of shared traits is a pattern seen consistently throughout the entire plant and animal kingdom, both in fossils and in living creatures.
And a lobster, doesn't take much education to see that's a lobster. Even though that's dated 146 million years and no change at all.
Lobsters, along with crabs and shrimps, are members of a subphyla group called crustaceans, for which we have a tremendous fossil record dating back to the Cambrian. If the first lobsters evolved from earlier crustacean species, we would expect to find earlier fossils with some, but not all, lobster features. And this is exactly what we find. There are several species of crustaceans that appear much earlier that are the likely ancestors of lobsters. These include Yawunic cutinae, dating from 508 million years ago.
Turtles, this interests me because I've always liked turtles. And we see the earliest turtle in the fossil record is indeed a turtle, and it doesn't take, a 5-year-old could look at that and say, that's a turtle.
The structure of a turtle's shell is unique in the animal kingdom, and until recently, its origins were not known. But recent fossil discoveries of early turtle ancestors, such as Papacheles, dating to 240 million years ago, help to show how the shell evolved. Papacheles had no upper shell, but the beginnings of a lower shell. A turtle's shell is actually made from fused ribs, and this early species clearly shows the beginnings of that transition. Early on, the front of the ribs broadened, then formed into the belly shell. This is seen in another species, Odontocheles, that appeared about 220 million years ago. Then the back of the ribs broadened and joined to form the back shell. And then you have basically what's a modern turtle.
So what? I guess they just don't make them like they used to, huh?
No!
Do you see how this shows another major flaw in Bergman's argument? He's looking for the earliest turtle fossil, or the earliest lobster fossil, or the earliest bee fossil. He's not looking for their possible ancestors, but the earliest one that he can identify as a member of that specific species. So, not only is he cherry-picking species that have had long periods of evolutionary stasis, but he is also cherry-picking what he considers to be the starting point of that particular creature's fossil record, with no regard for what may have come before it. Not only is the first turtle is a turtle an inane tautology, it's also intentionally misleading. Of course, the ancestors of an animal, regardless of what you call it, will look different, with more primitive features, and time again, we find fossils of ancestral forms of animals that appear earlier in the record.
Frog, same thing.
Now, the frog is a 280 million year old frog. You have beside it a modern day frog, and you're telling us that they're absolutely identical.
From what we can tell, and again, we don't have all of the tissue, so we can't do total
But
comparisons.
you've done so many different species that it seems to me we're building an incredible pattern here.
A very clear pattern we are building, that's true.
And the pattern is that you haven't shown us any evolution. None of these things have evolved. They have stayed identical. According to their numbers with the frog, they've stayed identical for 280 million years. Now, the question you ask is, so where is evolution happening?
That is the problem that evolutionists are aware of, and that is why creationists often point to the fossil record as one of the main evidences of creation.
So now the fossil record is not on the side of the evolutionist, it's on the side of the creationist.
From my study, about 25 years of the fossil record, clearly it supports creation and not evolution.
There are some things in this world that go way beyond human understanding. Things that cannot be explained, things that most people don't want to know about. That is where we come in.
So the question I guess I want to ask you at this point is, have you ever seen a fossil, and you've looked at thousands of them, and there are billions of them, and I'm sure if there were some that were supporting transition, you would see that. Have you ever seen a fossil that supported the concept of transition from species to species?
When you look carefully at it, it does not support whale evolution. Horse evolution is another example we look at. There are many examples. Human evolution is probably the most well known, but I've concluded pretty clearly that they may appear if you superficially look at the evidence, but once you examine it in detail, it does not support Darwinian evolution.
Notice how Bergman doesn't really answer the question, and instead tries to pretend that whales, horses, and humans are the only species claimed to show transitions. That's not remotely true.
Are there transitional forms, and will we know it if there were?
Is this a trick question?
Well, they theorize there are. What they try to do is they'll take a lot of fossils and they'll line them up and they'll say, well, this looks more primitive, this looks more advanced, this looks even more advanced, so therefore this must be a transitional form which led to this form. But indeed, that just is an assumption. There's no way of proving. I had a student ask me once, how do you know for sure that an animal is a transitional form? Well, you don't. You can't know, ever. All you can do is say, well, this seems to fit in the fossil record where it should be. It's the correct age according to what we've estimated. Therefore, we assume this must be a transitional form which evolved into something else. But indeed, it could just be an extinct animal, an animal that's not around today.
Dr. Bergman is technically right that we can't prove that any specific fossil species is the direct descendant of any other fossil species. But that is a complete non sequitur. It really doesn't matter. For example, it doesn't matter if Ambulocetus is a direct descendant of Pakicetus. It may or may not be. But both species are representative of the type of transition which must have occurred if evolution is true. They confirm the hypothesis that all forms evolved from earlier forms. And this is a prediction that evolution made long before we found many of the fossils we have today. All we need to show is that the predicted transitional forms do exist and in the predicted strata to show that fossils support evolution. And we have shown that in abundance with all the major plant and animal lineages. What would 6-day creationism predict? A fossil record that has all the animals that ever lived in the same ages of strata and grouped only by the environments in which they lived. Trilobites with sea lions and whales, Dimetrodons with rabbits and wolves, pterosaurs with eagles and bats. We never find anything like that. Also, with living creatures, we can prove common inheritance of different species with DNA. For example, DNA proves whales are more closely related to hippos than they are to any fish. Why would that be the case under creationism?
I don't know. I don't know.
Now, what did Darwin think we were going to find?
Okay, let me show you what he thought. In fact, in The Origin of Species, this was the only illustration he had in the entire book. And this was what he expected to find. The primitive life forms, and you notice they branch off. And so from this single form here, he expected that we would find a nice tree. And that's why they call this, the fossil record, a tree. And many drawings have been developed from that, and this is one of many. You can see right here the primitive life forms, and we've got, let's see, what else?
So all single form, single cell animal kind of things.
Right.
From the simple to the complex.
Right, and that's what they expected. But
Yes.
indeed, when we do research, and I have hundreds of these diagrams, by the way, but when we do research, what we find is the animal for chordates, for example, it appears in the fossil record, and then what we see is, in this case, chordates have become far more common, but they're around today, and we can see no evidence of transitional forms.
No, no, no. This one is particularly absurd because Bergman's own chart disproves his argument.
Back off, man. I'm a scientist.
The phylum Chordata includes all animals with a spinal cord. Today, that's all fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. But at the bottom of his chart, in the Silurian, starting 443 million years ago, it was just fish. Amphibians didn't appear until the late Devonian, 375 million years ago. The chart gets wider as you go up to show the emergence of new classes, orders, families, genera, and species of chordates. In other words, evolution. Lots of it. This is so dumb it's hard to tell what he's actually trying to say. He even said the chordates become more common. How does that happen without evolution? How many creations were there? He apparently is trying to say there is no way to link the chordates to the other phyla. That's not entirely true, but even if it was, it says nothing about all the tremendous evolutionary change within the Chordata phylum, for which we have a rich fossil record.
What you expect to find is something like this, which from this animal, not necessarily this one, these are echinoderms, which of course they don't hypothesize chordates evolved directly from echinoderms, but you would expect these to be all connected in the tree-like fashion, which is what you see here.
But what you have is straight lines.
What you have is straight lines. And again, there are hundreds of these examples, and these are actually based on finds in the fossil record.
No. What you have are funnel shapes, not straight lines. This is just astounding. Each of the phyla in the charts gets generally wider as you go up. That's new species emerging over time. This chart shows them as a solid region, but really each one is a tree or bush of its own, consisting of thousands of species. There is some mystery still about which phyla emerged from which before and during the Cambrian period. But that is to be expected, since it was so long ago, and the earliest animals were small and soft-bodied. Soft bodies don't fossilize well, and therefore we are missing lots of the detail we would need to link the earliest stems of the tree of life together. But to claim it's not a tree at all is absurd. It's like pointing to a lug nut of a car and saying, this is not a car because this part doesn't look like a car. This is called the fallacy of composition, implying that something that is true of some part is true of the whole. This is a common creationist tactic.
Don't put any of those old cheap moves on me.
No.
It's different.
I have all new cheap moves.
They look for gaps in our knowledge, which of course do exist, and try to pretend that that represents the general state of the entire body of knowledge. Not true.
And here's an example of a transitional set of forms. They start out here with supposedly the whale ancestor. Here's modern day whales, and here are the ancestors. And when you look at these pictures, it looks like, well, this sounds reasonable. The legs get shorter, smaller. They then are pointed backwards, and then they disappear, and you can see the front part, the skull, etc., becomes more and more crocodile-like, and then more and more whale-like. It looks logical when you look at it here, but when you actually look at the animal itself, this is the first animal in the series, and you can see there's a huge difference size-wise between this guy and the whale. This is the second animal in the series, third animal, fourth animal, fifth animal, and of course here's the whale. When you examine this very carefully, it's pretty convincing to me that indeed all we have is a bunch of extinct animals. In fact, you could take living animals and line this up pretty well to get a transitional set. But of course they don't do that because we're looking at extinct animals, because that's part of the definition of transitional. It's one that evolved to something else, and therefore it's not around today.
So all this shows is that we had small animals and we had big animals, but it doesn't show that one ever became the other.
No, there's no way you can prove that this guy evolved into this guy. You cannot scientifically prove it. Number one, it's history. Number two, all you can do is say, well, this guy lived a long time ago. This guy didn't live quite as long ago. They look kind of similar, so therefore maybe this guy evolved into this guy.
Bergman does a terrible job of presenting the evidence for whale evolution, and intentionally leaves out the most compelling facts.
You never studied.
The first animal in the sequence considered to be ancestral to whales is Pachycetus, which first appeared in the fossil record about 52 million years ago. They are known to be a member of the mammalian order Artiodactyla, which first appeared about 3 million years earlier, and still exists today. Pakicetus, like all transitional forms, shares certain unique features with its ancestral forms that came before, and with its descendant forms that appear later. Pakicetus is linked to the artiodactyls by its skeletal structure, particularly its teeth and feet. And it is linked to the whale lineage by its long snout and features of the inner ear found in today's whales and dolphins, which are unlike those of any other mammals. With subsequent species in the lineage, the legs got shorter, as Bergman pointed out, but also the hands and feet got enlarged like paddles, the tail got longer and more muscular, the teeth became more like those of modern toothed whales, and the nostrils moved back to the top of the head to become what today we call a blowhole, making breathing easier while swimming. The back legs diminished and disappeared, but left behind vestigial hip bones that are not connected to the rest of the skeleton and no longer provide any needed function. The bones of whale fins today still have 5 fingers in them, but are all concealed by a single paddle of skin. What good are jointed fingers inside a stiff fin? Also, DNA evidence confirms that whales share specific genetic similarities with today's existing artiodactyl descendants, and their closest living relative species is the hippopotamus. Bergman's main objection to the whale evolution fossil sequence is the size difference. Pakicetus was about the size of a wolf, but that is no problem for evolution, particularly when we are talking about tens of millions of years. And it's particularly silly when you remember that Bergman accepts that all domestic dogs share a recent common ancestor, including Chihuahuas, which average about 6 to 10 inches tall, and Great Danes, which are over 30 inches tall, over 3 times taller. Species sizes can change quite quickly with evolution. Whale evolution is a great example of transitional forms because we observe several features adapting from land-dwelling to ocean-dwelling, evolving at the same time, with several intermediate steps. And the best refutation Bergman can come up with is, well, they just superficially look like they evolved. He also says they're just animals that lived at different times. But if he believes in a single creation, how does he explain that these animals appear at different times? He makes a big deal about them being extinct animals, but makes no effort to explain why new species appear in the fossil record. Again, how many creations were there? You know, after watching countless hours of creationist videos, I too am noticing a pattern. Creationists are dishonest. You have to be to stoop to the level of cherry-picking of the data that Bergman does here, and to pretend that your sample is representative of the entirety of the actual evidence. Real science always tries to disprove its hypotheses. In contrast, creationists seek to find pieces of data that seem to confirm their closely held belief. When you do that, you can find support for almost any hypothesis, like all cats are black. As Aaron Ra and others have pointed out, to a creationist, it apparently doesn't really matter if it's really true. It only matters that you believe it. And that is consistent with their theology. Blessed is he who seeth not, and yet believeth. Bergman presents one of the most dishonest cases for creationism I have ever seen. He clearly is not ignorant of the facts. He just twists them to try to fit his belief. He cherry-picks species with long periods of evolutionary stasis, denies or misrepresents tremendous evidence of transitions, and completely ignores the continual appearance of new forms in the fossil record. He claims that the fossil record supports creationism, but never explains how. Which layers of strata represent the creation event? The Cambrian? No, that can't be the case. While many of the phyla existing today did evolve in the Cambrian, it took about 50 million years, and the forms were very primitive. Not even recognizable insects or plants existed yet. And also, there is tremendous fossil evidence of creatures existing well before the Cambrian, with microorganisms appearing 3 billion years earlier. To claim that the fossil record supports creationism, you have to ignore, well, nearly all of the fossil record. Thanks for watching.
Dr. Bergman, we believe that the purpose of science is to serve mankind. You, however, seem to regard science as some kind of dodge or hustle. Your theories are the worst kind of popular tripe, your methods are sloppy, and your conclusions are highly questionable. You are a poor scientist, Dr. Bergman.
I see.